Concerning the Canons of the Ecumenical Councils by Father Seraphim Rose. This excerpt is from his letter to Father Alexey Young, dated October 18th/31st, 1972, from the book Letters from Father Seraphim. Father Seraphim writes, Concerning canons, this is a great stumbling block specifically for converts. For one thing, because of the temptation to Phariseeism which we all have, and for another, because the canons, representing the law of the Church, can only be understood and applied within the tradition of the Church and in the Spirit who guides the Church. A large part of the Church's tradition is uncodified, being contained in lives of saints and patristic writings, to which there is no general index, thanks be to God, or else no convert would survive. And part of the Church's tradition is still unwritten. The canons are the most obvious part of the Church's tradition, and therefore some converts experience shipwreck by jumping on them and trying to apply them without even being aware of the whole tradition of which they are but one part. The canons were made for man, and not man for the canons. Some canons simply cannot or should not, at certain times or in certain circumstances, be applied with strictness. Hence, the Church's economy. Also, as a rule, the application of the canons and their economy is the business of bishops, and they do as much as possible with mutual consultation. How much more, then, should the rest of us refrain from trusting our own judgment with regard to them? Some of them, to be sure, that concern us directly, we must know about, and if possible, being taught by or consulting with others wiser in the faith, must be prepared to defend. For example, the canons regarding common prayer with heretics, the transgressing of which involves a betrayal of the very idea of the Church of Christ. Other canons, such as the permissible age for ordination to diaconate or priesthood, do not involve any such betrayal and are none of our business. And if we were to start making bishops accountable to ourselves, for them it would be exactly the same as if the bishops were to start interfering in the home and job life of ordinary parishioners. In general, however, the canons are doubtless too much stressed in polemics, and if we are to remain in the Church in these difficult times, it will be primarily because we are faithful to the spirit of the Church, and not to the canons. In a talk Father Seraphim gave at the St. Herman's Summer Pilgrimage on August 9, 1979, called Orthodox Christians Facing the 1980s, Father Seraphim taught, Our most important task, perhaps, is the Christian enlightenment of ourselves and others. We must go deeper into our faith, not by studying the canons of ecumenical councils or the Typicon, although they also have their place, but by knowing how God acts in our lives, by reading the lives of God-pleasers in the Old and New Testaments. We read the Old Testament far too little. It is very instructive. By reading the lives of saints and the writings of the Holy Fathers on practical spiritual life. By reading about the suffering of Christians today and in recent years. In all of this learning, our eyes must be on heaven above, the goal we strive for, not on the problems and disasters of earth below. In a letter written to Daniel Olsen on April 7, 1971, Father Seraphim writes, Just the other day I read an astute comment on the iconoclastic crisis of the 7th and the 8th centuries. Before the 7th Ecumenical Council, the Orthodox Church did not have any explicit doctrine on icons, and so one could argue that the iconoclasts were not heretics at all, and the dispute was one over the secondary issue of rite or practice. Nonetheless, the Church, in the person of her champions, the leading icon venerators, felt she was fighting a heresy, something destructive to the Church herself, and after her champions had suffered and died for this orthodox sensitivity, and her theologians had finally managed to put down explicitly in writing the doctrine she already knew in her heart, then the cause of orthodoxy triumphed at the 7th Ecumenical Council, and the iconoclasts were clearly singled out as heretics. I suspect that the very same thing, only much vaster and more complicated, is happening today. that those who feel orthodoxy, through living its life of grace and being exposed to and raised on its basic treasures, lives of saints, patristic writings, etc., are battling together against an enemy, a heresy, that has not yet been fully defined or manifested. Separate aspects or manifestations of it, chiliasm, social gospel, renovationism, ecumenism, may be identified and fought, but the battle is largely instinctive as yet, and those who do not feel orthodoxy in their heart and bones, for example, those who are brought up on concern and young life instead of lives of saints, do not really know what we're talking about, and they can't understand how you can become so excited over something which no council has ever identified as a heresy. In the testimony of the catacomb bishops of the late 1920s, one finds again and again that the GPU agents asked them first of all whether they were for or against Metropolitan Sergius. And if they were against, then these agents demonstrated that Sergius had violated neither dogmas or canons. Thus, either atheist torturers are defending the church, or else there is something dreadfully wrong, and the church is up against an extremely formidable enemy. As it turns out, however, there are several dogmatic and canonical grounds on which Metropolitan Sergius was wrong, but first of all, the Orthodox soul sensed that he was on the wrong side. In a letter written on April 20th/May 3rd, 1979, Father Seraphim writes to a young Barry who is preparing for baptism. Don't allow yourself to get stuck on the outward aspect of orthodoxy, whether the splendid church services, the high church to which you were drawn as a child, the outward discipline, fasts, prostrations, etc., being correct according to the canons, etc. All these things are good and helpful, but if one overemphasizes them, one will enter into troubles and trials. You are coming to orthodoxy to receive Christ, and this you should never forget.